The liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of a private power to the point where it becomes stronger than the state. Those words were spoken by perhaps the greatest president in America's history, who had led them through the Great Depression and into World War II. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, writing in a message to Congress in 1938, warned that if corporations were given too much power, they could form an oligarchy and hijack the government. He knew that if corporations were left unchecked, they could erode democracy and leave the country in the hands of a powerful oligarchy. Sadly, Roosevelt's warning was left unheard, and his words now seem prophetic as America swings closer and closer to an oligarchy under the Trump administration. He saw firsthand how unchecked freedom for businesses could easily become a trap and only benefit the wealthy elite, while undermining the democratic nature of America. The era in which he ruled was marked by an America with massive wealth inequality and an economy controlled by monopolies like Standard Oil. They controlled virtually entire industries, unions were crushed, and the majority of Americans had little hope of escaping poverty. And just 5 years before writing this message, a coalition of powerful oligarchs had tried to perform a coup against him. In many ways, the situation today is much worse. The wealth gap is more extreme than during his time, with the top 1% now controlling 40% of all of America's wealth. And corporations like Meta, Apple, and Amazon are monopolizing entire markets once again. The corporations no longer need to resort to a coup. They can rely on media manipulation, lobbying, and exploiting divisions within society. The erosion of democratic institutions has begun, but it's a much slower and more subtle process than he imagined. Unlike in FDR's era, there is no president today which seems capable of carrying out the reforms that he did. Both parties are subjects to corporate donors. The progressive movement FDR championed is at the brink of collapse. Its leaders are either too old to make real change or too young and lacking influence. With the death of this movement, the death of America will come as well. There will be no way to solve crises like FDR did before. It's 1933 and the Great Depression grips the nation, and FDR has just stepped into the leadership of a nation in crisis. Unemployment was at 25%, and millions of Americans were losing faith in the institutions that had supported them for generations. FDR responded with the New Deal, a series of reforms that would revive the economy and reduce corporate influence across the nation. He pushed for public works programs, social security, a minimum wage, and the rights of workers to unionize. And in this first term he halved unemployment and laid the groundwork for lasting recovery. And by the time he left office in 1945, the US was on the path to prosperity and growth and becoming the world's superpower. The wealth gap went from 25% to 15%. FDR's policies curbed corporate power and put the needs of the American people first. He not only pulled America out of the greatest economic crisis in its history, he also redefined the role of the government, making it a force for equality and justice across the nation. But despite FDR's reforms, by the time JFK took office in 1961, America was locked into the Cold War, and Americans once again began to distrust the government due to the Red Scare of the 1950s and the McCarthy trial. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum but faced fierce resistance from groups across the country, especially in the Deep South. Just 3 years earlier, President Eisenhower did deploy federal troops to enforce desegregation in places like Little Rock, Arkansas. African Americans were still systemically denied the vote across the South. They faced violence for attempting to use public facilities. Despite America's booming GDP, 1 in 5 Americans faced poverty, especially in rural areas like Appalachia. The unemployment among black Americans was double the national average. Urban housing was overcrowded, underfunded, and segregated. Felt to the young president to fix all these problems. But JFK had a plan, what he called the New Frontier. Initially he was slow in progressing as he wanted to avoid alienating Southern Democrats, but as people across the nation watched as peaceful black protesters were brutally suppressed, he hardened his stance. He federalized the National Guard to protect the integration of the University of Mississippi in 1962. And on the economic front, he pushed for an increase in the minimum wage, extended unemployment benefits, and launched pilot programs for job training and housing. He also began investing in science and education and laid the groundwork for the war on poverty that Lyndon Johnson would later expand. Although his presidency was tragically cut short by his assassination, he realigned the Democratic Party with the cause of social justice and set the tone for the struggles and reforms that would define the rest of the 1960s. But it wasn't just JFK who forced change. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act did not come from the top down. They were forced from the bottom up through years of struggle. MLK preached non-violent resistance, organising marches in towns like Birmingham and Selma. Activists like Tom Hayden, David Dellinger and Abbie Hoffman all led protests against the Vietnam War and for racial and economic justice, led ordinary Americans in the struggle for equality. Their lesson that ordinary Americans can change politics just as much as the politicians can should not be forgotten today. But just as change was being forced, the corporations began to fight back. In 1971, corporate lawyer Lewis Powell wrote a now infamous memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, called for corporations to fight back, and urged corporations to infiltrate universities, control media narratives, and flood Washington with lobbyists. This memo will become the corporate blueprint from then till now. Nixon was the first to use this. He began gutting public institutions in the name of law and order politics. Even Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, began following the new liberal handbook, began deregulating industries and weakening labor protections. But it was Reagan who would do the most damage. He declared that the government is not the solution to the problem, and the government is the problem. He slashed taxes on the rich and broke the power of unions, also starved public institutions and broke a lot of America's safety nets. Social security, public housing, healthcare and education were bled dry, whilst corporations grew richer and more powerful and began to write laws in their own image. Reagan had undone much of FDR's and JFK's work. We still see the consequences today. Just can't afford healthcare, schools are crumbling, wages have stagnated, whilst billionaires like Elon Musk fund joyrides into space. And it didn't end with Reagan. Bill Clinton doubled down and ended welfare, embraced financial deregulation. The Democratic Party stopped representing labor. Bush further cut taxes for the rich and launched trillion-dollar wars under false pretense, wasting public funds and enriching the military-industrial complex. While Obama did bring progress in healthcare expansion, marriage equality and the auto bailout, he failed to bring major change. During the 2008 economic crisis, he bailed out banks, whilst millions lost their homes and livelihoods. This opened the doorway for Trump in 2016 to feed on the disillusionment of the American people. His first term, Trump gutted labor protections, empowered corporations, and appointed judges who tore its civil rights whilst handing over the country to billionaires behind closed doors. Joe Biden didn't do enough to solve the disillusionment of Americans, paving the way for Trump's second term. Where so far he has ruined the economy, gutted labor protections further, and destroyed civil rights. Trump isn't the problem. He's a symptom of a larger disillusionment with the American system after 40 years of sabotage. And without pressure, both the Democrats and Republicans will continue to serve corporate interests instead of the people. FDR didn't save America alone. He was supported by suffering workers and fierce organizers. Kennedy stood on the shoulders of civil rights leaders who risked everything to forge America into a better place. And the legacy of the progressives like FDR and JFK lays with too few people. People like Bernie Sanders, who are quickly aging and had to fight their entire lives for an ideology based in justice, equality and dignity that used to dominate American politics. And if we're not careful, the force that has saved America time and again might die with him. And there will be no one left to save America from oligarchy and corporate interests. And the duty of carrying his torch lies with us in supporting figures like AOC and carrying the torch ourselves. We're following the legacy of figures like Abbie Hoffman and Tom Hayden in pressuring the government to not stand for corporate interests before the people. If we're lucky, we can not only take America back from oligarchy peacefully, but also claim many of the rights we have lost and are yet to gain.